Okay, let's move on to the next one. This one is from Alistair. And the question is, so we had Lauren Colenso Semple on the show some number of months ago. I've lost track of time. But she's one of our coaches at Stronger by Science. And we were talking about training. And she basically suggested an idea. I don't think she was like, leaning hard into it. It's not like her main coaching philosophy that she's about to write an ebook about or anything like that. But she talked about the value in sometimes rather than doing like 6 sets of the same exercise, saying, well, why don't you just do one set of 6 different exercises and present a more varied stimulus for the muscle? And so the question here is there any reason to believe that changing exercises circumvents the diminishing returns effect of doing multiple sets?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it's not one to which I have a firm answer. But what I will say is that I think that the effect of doing like multiple different exercises with the same number of sets, I think that the net impact of that would either be neutral at worst or possibly positive. The reason I say possibly positive is that I'm not sure that it would have an impact on, say, just like total lean body mass accretion or total like arm lean mass accretion or anything like that. But there is some evidence that varying exercises helps kind of target all regions of a particular muscle or all muscles within a muscle group more effectively. So, and that statement, I think, like 5 years ago would have been completely decried as bro science, but now there's actually a pretty fair amount of evidence for it. So to start with, I think probably the first study that I bring up when having this discussion is one from Fonseca and colleagues in 2014. The title is Changes in Exercise Are More Effective Than in Loading Schemes to Improve Muscle Strength. And so essentially in that study, they had 4 groups. One of them, so the way that study worked is it was a training study with volume increasing over time. And in one of the groups, what they did is they kept the exercise the same the whole time, the exercise being Smith machine squats, but they varied the load throughout, kind of like an undulating periodization deal. In another group, they kept just the exercise the same, only Smith machine squats, didn't vary the load, so it was like 80% 1RM for every session. One of the groups, they varied the exercises. So they had 4 lower body exercises in total, Smith machine squats being one of them, but I think also leg press, lunges, and deadlifts maybe. So 2 of the groups, they had that variety of exercises. One of them, again, used varying loads, so kind of like a undulating periodized approach. And one of them just stuck with about 80% 1RM for every session for those 4 different exercises. And so the net result of that study is, I want to say strength gains were pretty similar in every group, or maybe they were better in the groups that varied exercises. I don't remember that one for sure, but this question is about hypertrophy, and I do remember this one for sure. What they found hypertrophy-wise, they were looking at quad growth, and essentially like vastus lateralis growth and just like generalized quad growth was pretty similar in all 4 groups. But the groups that varied exercises throughout the study had like better growth in all 4 heads of the quads. So like general quad growth was pretty similar in all of the groups, but the ones that varied exercises like had more vastus intermedius growth or vastus medialis growth. So like kind of overall well-rounded quad hypertrophy favored the groups that varied exercise, even though like generalized quad growth was probably pretty similar across the board. So that's looking at different muscles within a single muscle group. There's also some research looking at regional activation with different exercises targeting the same muscle group. So this is the piece that a few years ago people would have decried as bro science. The idea was basically, if you activate the hamstrings, the entire muscle gets activated, and it's probably going to have a relatively similar hypertrophic effect all the way up and down the length of the muscle. What we found since then is there's kind of like, well, essentially just that regional activation is possible. if you activate the hamstrings, like the middle of the hamstrings muscle, the proximal parts of it, the distal parts of it, are all probably going to activate to a similar degree. But based on the exercises you choose, you can have, say, greater proximal hamstring activation or greater distal hamstrings activation based on the different sorts of exercises you choose. Specifically here, like hip extension type exercises seem to kind of activate the whole muscle somewhat equally, or maybe slightly more like the proximal parts of the hamstring, like closer to your butt. And like knee extension type stuff knee flexion type stuff, seems to activate kind of the distal portions of it closer to the back of your knee a little bit more. But that's a generalizable thing that we found with different exercises in different muscle groups. So by varying exercise for the same muscle or the same muscle group, you may get a little bit more well-rounded hypertrophy up and down the entire length of a muscle instead of just concentrated at the point that, say, a particular exercise would target with regional activation. This is a bit of an aside, but just to illustrate how plastic muscle fibers are, there was actually a rodent study, which I didn't dig up before recording this, but which Andy Galpin shared, I don't know, maybe a year ago at this point. But it was looking at myosin heavy chain isoform densities up and down the length of an entire muscle fiber. So essentially, like a decent amount of your muscle fibers aren't just like pure type 2 or pure type 1. They'll have like a mixture of type 1 myosin and type 2 myosin heavy chains. And it found that like the amount of type 1 versus type 2 myosin heavy chains can actually vary up and down the length of a single muscle fiber, which suggests that like there were probably some adaptations going on that would spur that like, you know, maybe the proximal or the distal part of that fiber was getting generally more work in that mouse's day-to-day life. So anyway, muscles are pretty plastic, and I do generally think that varying the exercises you use to target a particular muscle will probably give you more well-rounded growth down the entire length of that muscle or across that entire muscle group. So as I said to start with, if you're just interested in just sheer total growth, like maybe muscle volume just as a gross measure of that entire muscle size, I don't know that varying exercises is going to affect that so much. I kind of think it will, but I'm not sure about that. But I do think it will probably give you more well-rounded growth, again, kind of across the entire muscle and throughout the entire muscle group. And I certainly don't think it's going to be worse for total hypertrophy. Now, in terms of how you accomplish that, I don't necessarily know that you would need to do it the way Lauren suggested of, like, you know, maybe using 6 different exercises for one muscle group within a workout instead of just 6 sets of one exercise. You know, it could be you do a 4-week block of one exercise, and then you do a 4-week block of another exercise, and then you do a 4-week block of another exercise. Or it could be, you know, if you're training biceps twice a week, you do 2 sets of 3 different exercises on one day, and then you do 2 sets of 3 different exercises on the other day. Like, I don't think that you have to use all of those exercises within one session. There's different ways you could set that up, but I am generally in favor of like varying the exercises you use to attack a particular muscle group. Again, if your primary goal is hypertrophy. If it's strength, then, you know, you probably don't want to stray too far away from the exercises you're primarily using to test strength. So if you're a powerlifter, you should probably be doing a fair amount of squat, bench, deadlift. Maybe have some variation in there, but, you know, probably the majority or at least a good bulk of your work coming from the classical exercises. But if your goal is hypertrophy, I think variation's generally a good thing. And one other possible benefit as well is just motivation. And here, different people are wired differently. Some people want a reasonably small stable of exercises they do. They want to do them all the time. They want to be able to more directly be able to compare their performance in this session to, you know, the session they just did 3 days ago and the session they did 4 days before that, et cetera, et cetera. But for a lot of people, like, variety is the spice of life, and they just, like to do more exercises and kind of get bored if they do the same stuff all the time. That doesn't apply to everyone, but it does apply to some people. So just to kind of wrap this up and bring it home, varying exercises, especially doing a bunch for a single muscle group within one session, I don't know that it's strictly better. I think at worst, it's probably about as good as doing a bunch of sets of just one exercise. But I do think it is probably at least somewhat beneficial for ensuring well-rounded development of the particular muscle group that you're trying to target.
I should be fair here. The example I put forth of doing like 6 different exercises in the same workout, that might have been a straw man. I simply don't remember with a great deal of detail exactly the scenario we talked about with Lauren. So if I made an egregious, exaggerated straw man, my sincerest apologies.